Are narrative elements or gameplay elements more important? And that's like asking, is the chicken or the egg more important? Both have their place and both are essential to a cohesive experience. I actually recently had this conversation with Alex Yee and Devin Gill. They were the first narrative designers at Riot Games. One of the things as we had our discussion came up really consistently is that you need a certain element of both. You can be inspired by game mechanics to create a story that reinforces them. Or you can create a really strong story package, right, that then you're trying to sell with game mechanics. However, I will say this. You're at greater risk of making shitty gameplay when you have a story that you're pre-written beforehand. And that unfortunately means that you're less likely to make something more novel and significant, right? Most games aren't Last of Us. They're not taking that core framework of FPS gameplay, but mostly novel visuals and significant styling and all this big story reinforcement. Most games are because players want to play it. They want to become the thing that's within the game. And so I like to say that you should be fantasy informed and mechanically developed before finalizing your actual narrative design. It's not enough to just have a fantasy. It's not enough to just have some gameplay. You want to go back and forth between them. It's like tightening the lug nuts on a wheel. You don't want to tighten one all the way because then it's harder to get the rest of them in place. You want to go around from character to character, playing off of their mechanics, their fantasy, their structure, right, in order to assemble a cohesive package. I recently been playing Expedition 33. Expedition 33 is a great example of characters that are well assembled. They work together very novelly at the gameplay level, but ultimately their gameplay mechanics are built upon a well-known foundation. It's basically a combination of turn-based RPGs, traditional Persona or Final Fantasy style, with the features from Mario RPG allowing you to block and parry, right? And in these type of cases, where are they going to go with there? Well, they're going to work on style. They're going to work on quality of the interconnection and links between those characters. And so we see the elevation of that game, and why it stood out is because they took something that was foundationally kind of structured and then said, how can we improve each of these? They made their characters interact in more interesting and dynamic ways. They made the stories of the characters kind of really tightly bound to this strange universe that the characters exist within. And as a result of this, you can tell this constant bouncing back and forth between the characters, how they play, and do those fantasy of the mechanics match the fantasy of the actual characters in their story. Some of the characters like Mayao, the young, independent swords girl, does very well on her own. Now, later in the game, she develops skills that can then support other teammates. Whereas a couple of the other characters like Gustav are a little bit one note. Build up your combo, do your thing, and the hooks between them and the other characters are actually quite weak. So I would always say that if you're trying to develop a game, you need to get the gameplay loop done first. If you don't have something that is novel and interesting, you're basically leaning into your cinematography, your storytelling, your plot. Plenty of games try to do this, but they can often fall into the hole of their gameplay not being above a certain threshold to make the game, successful. So what do I think of games that basically create mechanics to serve the narrative? I think it's totally fine. I do think that it needs to be almost a super genre of categories. A lot of people get really tied up with this concept of, am I a game or not? And there's this entire space of interactive experiences, right? These don't necessarily have to be a game with a harsh goal. Maybe you can't fail. Maybe they're simply something you experience along the way or something you interact with to observe the story. I think Gone Home is a great example where you're going through an empty home, looking at pictures, finding clues. Eventually you find a little panel and you find your sister's diary. Those experiences are great. I think instead if we say, is it interactive entertainment? It absolutely is. You interact with the world, you discover things about it by seeing it through the lens of the character's eye. And those experiences are wonderful. That said, I don't think that they fall into the traditional example of games. What is a game? A game is something where you have a starting position, an end goal, and obstacles to get in your way, and you utilize tools and techniques to overcome them. And so I'd say those aren't really games, but it doesn't need to be something that matters to the creators, right? Go make the thing you want to make. Generally, you want players doing the things in the game that align with the story you are telling. The more the player is thematically and mechanically aligned with the same difficulties and disruptions that the character is, the more it feels like you are playing as that character. When it's life is strange and feeling like, could I just undo this? What happened if I made this other decision instead? The sort of conflicts connect deeply with those characters and align thematically. It doesn't really matter if it's a traditional game or not. I think visual novels are very enjoyable experiences. Doki Doki Literature Club, which for better or for worse is on autopilot. All the decisions you make don't really matter. Still an engaging and interesting interactive experience. While those may not be the type of games that I'm skilled at crafting, I very much appreciate them and I think we need more of them in the world. So, for devil's advocate's sake, why would someone argue for narrative being more important than game mechanics? Well, in that case, it's really that they are there to tell a story. They have a piece of literature that they want to express, and they simply want to express it through the medium of a video game. And I really think that separating structure from medium is incredibly important. Once you do those two, right, you can say, oh yeah, you can totally use Unreal or Unity or whatever you want to tell the story you want to tell. You can make someone chop a fish head 100 times in a row to get the sense of being distracted at work, right? And that's wonderful. In those cases, it's because they are trying to take the player and make a physical connection between the emotional state of the character and the emotional state of the human being playing the game. In those cases, right, you don't focus on novel gameplay. You don't focus on deeply systemic mechanics that will scale for 1,000 hours. You're there to tell an 8-hour story. And in those cases, the narrative should trump the mechanics, right? Because in those situations, you are focused on telling the story. That is your number one pillar. The gameplay is simply a vector to keep you engaged and paying attention and wake you up whenever you start to zone out in that experience. So some players say that if your gameplay is good enough, you don't need a story. Well, I think that in some cases that's fine, right? Do you really need a story in a match 3 game? Not really. Maybe think about Baba is You. Is there any reason to be a rabbit running around pushing these letter blocks? Not really. The puzzle was the engagement. But I think a lot of people enjoy it when there's a progression. There's little cutscenes that go from mission to mission like there was in Seven Nights and other mobile games. But I do think that either way, you need to have a richly informed sense of the world in which you inhabit if you want to hit a level of memorability and uniqueness. It's not enough to just say, hey, I'm going to take Donkey Kong, but now he's going to be blue, and instead of wearing a tie, he's going to wear a bowler hat, right? And go with it. It's not enough to just take these things and swap a new color of paint on it, just the same way you taking existing gameplay and redoing them with a slight tweak doesn't really bring novel experiences. But I do think that there is a place for saying this is a game that is heavily gameplay focused. Story and theme are not the focus of what I'm working on right now. And for years and perhaps even decades, you can develop and build this up and say, actually, this is good enough. Balatro doesn't really have a story, but was highly engaging, considered one of the most successful games of the year that it came out. It means that just as we can have a story without game, you can have game without story. But I do think that either way, the story in those games actually becomes the player's experience of the game, and that's the story you tell. Just as you can have games without story, you can have stories without game, and I don't see an issue with people pursuing one or the other.